Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you virtually today and so thrilled that you all are interested in the exhibition. And I have to say, I've been getting sneak peeks, little text message images of the exhibition installation. It's looking beautiful, and I just hope you all enjoy it in person. Um, well, let's get started. Robert Frank and Todd Webb Across America 1955 first opened in Houston on October 8th, 2023, made a stop at the Addison Galleries before coming to beautiful Brandywine. And it was the first exhibition of a group of shows organized to celebrate Robert Frank's centennial. And let me make sure this is going to move. There we go. And if you ask me, it was the perfect exhibition to kick off the centennial celebration because Robert Frank's 1955 Guggenheim work is what brought him to global attention. And yet, despite the thousands of articles written about Frank and his 1955 project, not a single one investigated the other Guggenheim winner who also decided to go cross country in the same year, Todd Webb. This exhibition is the first time these simultaneous and similar projects have been seen side by side. In fact, it is the first time Todd Webb's 1955 cross-country work has been seen at all. And as one of my MFAH donors said to me, how has no one done this before? It's not like it's a complicated idea. And I didn't take that personally. I didn't feel like it was a critique of my minuscule idea. Instead, I just flat out agree. I'm thankful to be the first curator that gets to tell this tale. This exhibition is the story of two men's journeys across the US in 1955 as they both attempted to photograph the real America, a complicated idea. And I want to be clear that as much as I was the first to tackle this subject, both photographers had left a clear path. They wrote about their projects, what they thought, and how it changed them. And so I tried as much as possible to keep any curatorial voice out of the gallery. I wanted to let Webb and Frank speak directly to you about their experiences, so you'll notice in the exhibition when you finally get to see it that the labels next to the work provide direct quotes from the photographers about that scene or location shown in the photo. It's their story to tell. And while they tell it in their different voices and with different perspectives, their lessons and their realizations were very similar. And this idea of letting the photographers lead, letting their personalities shine through, was the undercurrent in the curatorial process. So these, what you see on your screen right now, are letters each photographer wrote to their wives from the road. Now, I'm not asking you to be a handwriting expert here, but just take a minute to think about the kind of person who would have written each one. Just looking at these pages, we already begin to understand the character of our two photographers. Todd Webb's letter, which is on the left, is precise. It's evenly spaced. It's level. Precise, even, level. These are good descriptors of his personality. Now, Robert Frank's letter, which is on the right, is a little more hastily done. The words kind of wrap the paper in unique ways, and it's almost working against the confinement of the edges. This rapid and adaptive style is also typical of Frank's personality. So these letters, their words, help us to understand the personalities of these two men a bit better. Personality, after all, plays a big role in personal choice and in artistic production. In Robert Frank and Todd Webb Across America, it was important to reveal how the two men's personalities formed their methods, their artistry, and finally their message. Now, most people that love photography and photo history know the name Robert Frank. Now, Robert Frank is indisputably one of the most famous and influential photographers of the 20th century. In addition to his innumerable accolades, he was called, quote, the artist who best captured America, which is certainly high praise. And much of this fame rests on his book, The Americans, which was first published in the US in 1958. With 83 images in its slim frame, the photo book is now a classic, selling out in each of its reprintings and continually influencing ever more generations of photographers. Now, with that kind of influence, it's no wonder that Frank has taken on mythological status in the field of photographic history. And in fact, he's so revered in photo circles that it's often difficult to separate the truth of Frank from his real character and the many, many myths that surround his life and work. And true character or personality, remember, is what we're after here. Now, this is one of my favorite myths, the shoes. These red and yellow wingtips are housed at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York, and there they are labeled as Robert Frank's shoes, and it's further suggested that these outrageous things are the ones he wore while traveling the US on his 1955 Guggenheim-funded trip. Or at least that's the myth. See, it's unclear if these are really the shoes that Frank wore on his journey. In fact, we don't know if they're his shoes at all. I spoke with colleagues at the Visual Studies Workshop where they're housed, and they admitted this is all based on rumor and hearsay. No one can truthfully say these are Robert Frank's shoes. And yet, the suggestion of a connection to Frank and his famous work in 1955 has raised these odd accessories to the level of religious relics in photography circles. Now, the originality of Frank's work and its lasting importance on the field of photography are without question. We're not going to question that today. Yet, if these shoes are any indication, the true story of the artist and his work is obscured in myth and legend. Now, other myths about Frank abound. You've probably heard some of these, that he was a complete outsider with no knowledge of the United States, that no American publisher would consider publishing the books, that all critics despise the work, that the response to the work made Frank give up photography entirely. These myths have persisted, but they are wrong. They have been flatly disproven by many scholars and in fact by Frank himself. Endless books, articles, and essays have been written about Frank and the Americans, but it's so difficult to parse the truth from the myth. But I had a research advantage. In 1986, Ann Tucker, MFAH's founding curator of photography, launched the epic book
Thank
and
you all. I got it.
exhibition, New York to Nova Scotia. It was the first exhibition to explore Robert Frank's full career, not just the famous series, The Americans, but the work he did before and after. And here you see Ann Tucker on the far right, listening to Robert Frank on the far left. Working closely with the photographer himself, Ann's exhibition relaunched him into the national and international scene. And in that exhibition, MFAH proudly displayed its full set of The Americans, the original maquette for the book, which you will see again in the exhibition at Brandywine, and also a broad selection of Frank's work throughout his life. This previous exhibition that happened in my own institution meant that I had access to Frank's letters to curator Ann Tucker, which included his thoughts on his own work, how it should be seen, exhibited, and conveyed to viewers. And I knew I could trust these letters and this exhibition because Robert Frank loved it. As a result, oh, I should describe what you're looking at here. This is the original catalog in the center. On the left is a phone message to Ann Tucker from Clark Winter, who's actually one of the trustees of the Robert Frank Foundation. He was visiting Frank at the time that the catalog first arrived in Nova Scotia, and Frank got to see it, and he said, Robert is delighted. Robert received the catalog and is delighted. And in response, Robert himself, as you can see on the far right, wrote Anne a letter and signed it, "Your most obedient photographer," which I love. Now, as a result of that, I started to learn the truth about Robert Frank, but what was the truth about Todd Webb? Well, I first encountered Todd Webb while researching another exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe Photographer. And for that project, I was tracking the photographs that Georgia O'Keeffe made and came to learn that she asked a good friend named Todd Webb to give her lessons with her camera and to print many of her photos. On the left, you see Todd and Georgia chatting in her Abiquiu courtyard. And on the right, the catalog for that exhibition with a picture of O'Keeffe holding her camera taken by Todd Webb. And as I explored who this man was, I was shocked to learn that Webb had also received a Guggenheim Foundation grant in 1955 to go cross country. No book, no article, no exhibition on the hundreds of that have been launched on Frank and the Americans had ever mentioned another photographer working on a similar project at the same time with the same funding. So clearly there were a lot of questions to be asked. Why hadn't Webb's photographs been seen? What would happen if you put Todd Webb's images side by side with Robert Frank's? What would this comparison reveal? Not only about America in 1955, but about Webb, about Frank. How different was their perspective? How much was the same? And thanks to the Todd Webb archive, I was given the permission and access to begin exploring. But a little about Todd Webb first. Now, Todd Webb had an eclectic history before he found his calling as a photographer in his late 30s. Webb was born in Detroit in 1905, quote, "on the kitchen table," as he joked. And this homespun, humble attitude would endear him to legions of friends and colleagues throughout his life. Webb worked as a banker, a stockbroker, a gold prospector, a ranger in the Forest Service, a farmer, and a writer. But it was not until he returned to Detroit in 1938 that he tried photography. And he said, "I was sunk. I fell for it." Upon moving to New York City to immerse himself in photography, he found success and camaraderie among an impressive group. He worked with Alfred Stieglitz to photograph installations and the artists featured at an American Place. And in fact, Stieglitz thought of him as his mentee and gifted Todd Webb his cameras. Roy Stryker of Standard Oil and Walker Evans at Fortune magazine contracted him for projects. They loved him. He was one of their favorite photographers. He had regular lunches with famous photographers Bernice Abbott and Lisette Modell, and was featured in more than a dozen exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art. Yet, Todd Webb is not a name we hear today. And it soon became clear why I hadn't heard of him very much and had never heard of his 1955 project. Webb's entire archive became inaccessible in 1976 after a dealer took possession of trunks of all of Webb's negatives and prints made before that time, but never paid Webb the full agreed purchase price. So in the key years of photographic history, the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the history of American photography is literally being written in newly established academic courses and museum institutions, Webb's work is absent from the conversation because it was completely locked away. Now, in 2016, director of the Todd Webb Archive, Betsy Evans Hunt, tracked down the missing trunks and brought them back to light. And 3 years later, I was able to take a peek and see what was in them. Well, the answer, and I was just looking at 1955, was more than 10,000 negatives that Webb took on his journey as he walked, boated, and biked across America. And with his notebooks, which you see here and you'll see in the exhibition, his daily journal, which is a researcher's dream, and the negatives, I was able to recreate his path cross country and his thinking along the way. And because I'm a visual learner, visual person, I mapped it. Through this laborious process of looking, reading, and mapping, I came to understand what Webb was seeing and how he felt about it. He wasn't ambiguous. He is very clear in his perspective. His position is always revealed in his writing. And that is something Webb shared with Robert Frank, a clarity of vision and purpose. Now, Robert Frank was born in Switzerland on November 9th, 1924, and he grew up focused on photography, even as the cloud of Nazi rule descended. He took his early photo lessons with his neighbor who worked in a photo studio, and after a brief military service, he worked a string of jobs in photography and film. After the war, he traveled to Paris, Milan, and Antwerp before he booked passage to America. And there, Frank won a job from Alexei Brodovich, editor of Harper's Bazaar. But as he was a young and kind of untested photographer, Brodovich gave him assignments for Junior Bazaar, which you see here. And really, after only a short time in this position, Frank resigned. He had enough. The magazine life did not suit him, and money and fame were not good enough reasons for him to stay. Frank noted that many of the successful photographers that surrounded him had, quote, no spirit. The only thing that mattered was for them to make money. And I understand where he's coming from. Well, he actually aimed his critique pretty directly at picture magazines such as Life and Look. They held a preeminent place in American culture in 1955 and created a mythological image of America with text and photographs. And in a quest to increase readership and profits, these magazines cultivated a comforting, didactic, and ideological voice. And these magazines also helped to create a system of production and consumption in which photography became just another product to be consumed. And Webb and Frank were both angry at this. They felt that photography was a subjective art. It should be about your internal feelings, not external relations that can be bought and sold. So, in October 1954, both photographers submitted their applications to the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. They were disillusioned with the popular taste of photography, like in Life and Look, and resolved to produce work in their own way. And so they both designed these kind of epic solo projects suited to their individual styles and temperaments rather than the fad of the day. And I'll ask you again to think about the way their character is revealed in their writing as I describe it. Todd Webb submitted 6 single-paged, carefully typed pages outlining exactly, day by day where he felt he would end up. His plan to walk, boat, and walk and bike across the US from New York to California, and he said to depict, quote, vanishing America and what is taking its place. His precise, clearly planned application, again, is indicative of his steady and careful character. In contrast, Robert Frank's application was 2 double-spaced pages, also revealing of his nature. He wrote in his application, I love this, quote, the project I have in mind is one that will shape itself as it proceeds. The material is there, the practice will be in the photographer's hand, and the vision in his mind. So he's not even describing it. He's saying, I'm going to do it. Don't worry about it. It'll all come together eventually. Love it. And it's important to note that Webb, 49 years old at the time of his application, was part of an older generation. And I mean that not only in terms of age, but also in photographic style. A student of Walker Evans, Webb believed in precision, perfect lighting, and a perfect print, as it had been defined by the generations of photographers before him. He chose a form of transportation best suited to these interests, walking. His slower pace matched his careful method of image capture. Now, Frank was younger. Frank was 29 years old at the time of his application and was interested in the present and its influence on the future. To travel the US, Frank chose a car, a Ford Business Coupe. And like his chosen style of transportation, Frank was interested in speed and brief glimpses. His photos paired movement with selective focus, some shot from the window of his car, a style and a method he felt particularly suited for America. And I would note that previous to this project, Frank had produced work more in Webb style, that kind of careful, precise style, but he felt it wasn't suited to America and the speed he recognized in the nation. So he chose a different path. So I love how they're choosing different styles and different methods, but what's interesting is there are very close similarities. Now, Webb began his journey first. He set out on April 20th with a full pack, 3 cameras and small notebooks, one for his journal and one as an exposure record. He averaged about a roll of film a day for 5 months. That's how long it took him to cross the country. And it didn't take long before he noted that his intent to capture evidence of cultural lineage, that vanishing Americana and what was taking its place, was harder than he anticipated. So 3 days later, on April 23rd, in central Pennsylvania, he wrote in his journal, quote, "I would say that people in general in this section lack cultural and intellectual interests." Sorry for anyone out there. They seem to have strong interests in the land and in being neat and taking care of their property. And they do have a sort of unwitting pride in the historical background of this place, but without very much real knowledge. So rather than historical pride or knowledge, Webb noted the shining new cars, the new gadgets, the desire to consume as the primary way these Americans lived. In St. Louis, it got a little worse. Webb recognized something more disturbing at the local zoo, a contemporary sign of shameful American history. Just inside the gates, he encountered a Black school group, the children no older than 9 or 10. Webb's attention was drawn to the reaction of the majority white crowd, who shot glances at the children. Quote, "Soon we will wonder how it happened," he wrote in his journal. "How Joe McCarthy got to be the boss, how we became the tools of Hitler, discrimination." Webb's frustration at these microaggressions inspired him to raise his ever-present camera, capturing many images, but this one is so poignant. This young Black girl walking against the crowd with her head down, her gaze lowered, and that white mother behind her at the right, clutching her possessions and staring at her in alarm. Now, notably, Webb's light bulb moment, his major realization, was sparsely recorded. Only 3 photos and a line or 2 in his journal. In fact, he noted in his writing that he needed time to process what he had witnessed because it was so impactful for him. On July 4th, Independence Day, he had visited the Taos Pueblo. And the Pueblos are the oldest continuously inhabited communities in the United States. For Webb, these were an ideal example of cultural lineage that he had been looking for all along, but instead, what he found horrified him. He was struck by the way the Native Americans were, quote, "stared at and photographed by tourists." There is little humility there and little real interest in the people. Through this experience, Webb came to realize that American lineage is not visible in a picturesque building in a square or the preservation of wagon stops in the plains as he had expected. Instead, he found American lineage in the way we treat each other. For Webb, American lineage, the dark side of it, was perceived in the various forms of destruction and injustice and rabid, unfeeling consumption perpetuated in the name of American freedom. And as he continued his journey, Webb made peace with this reality. He was a gentle soul, and he didn't outwardly critique what he witnessed, but he presented the evidence of American consumption plainly, like the craze for uranium demonstrated in bright neon signs, or the unrelenting consumption evident in the graveyards of cars. And in other photos, Webb captured the scene with the same critique, but with a just tiny dash of gentle humor. It was his way of making you first laugh and then realize the truth. Like this truck stop cowboy who dwarfs the actual humans drawn to the giant, or the incongruity of a tough local saloon and the childlike gumball machine on the bar. Webb noted about this image, quote, Dodge City is a little pitiful about trying to keep its title of cowboy capital of the world. I don't think a cow has shown a teat in town for years, let alone a real cowpoke. Now, Frank, of course, did not keep a daily journal like Webb, yet he speaks volumes through his letters and the thousands of images he made on his journey, more than 28,000 in all. So you see the quicker pace than Webb. One of Frank's first stops on his journey was the Ford Motor Plant in Detroit, Michigan, the birthplace of the symbol of mid-century American life, the car. In a letter home to his then wife, Mary, Frank described the car plant, quote, every factory is really the same, but this one is God's factory, if there is such a thing. I am sure that the devil gave him a helping hand to build up what is called Ford's River Rouge plant. Now, Frank was not a religious man, but he was sarcastic, and his invocation of God was likely a snide reference to Henry Ford, who had designed the factory to be completely self-contained, fed and run entirely by Ford businesses. And yet to Frank, it was the devil that was really at work in this gleaming monument to soul-crushing efficiency. Frank's experiences in Detroit ignited his view that, quote, it was a powerful country, but a hypocritical one. It was brutal. Now, this is slightly different because when Frank first arrived in America in 1947, he wrote home to his parents and said, this country is really a free country. A person can do what he wants. But in the years that followed that first enthusiastic letter, and as he moved along his journey in 1955, and I might add that on that journey, he was arrested either 3 or 4 times. We're not quite sure. No one's been able to quite put it together yet. Sometimes for the crime of simply looking foreign in the South. He started to change his view of America a little bit. And he said, quote, power and money, and that, especially the latter, is the mark of success upon which the system insists. That's the way it is in America. Now, on his journey, Frank wrote his parents from Los Angeles, noting, quote, since I have been working on the Guggenheim project, my attitudes about what I am doing have changed. America is an interesting country, but there's a lot here I do not like and that I would never accept. I'm trying to show this in my photos. It is important to note that despite popular myth, Frank was not critical of the everyday people he photographed. In fact, when Frank himself, when he got to choose the words to describe his Americans project, the most common word he used was love. Frank had deep empathy for people. and a deep love for America. He wanted to see the country he adopted and loved do better. So he aimed his critiques at the systems of money and power that kept people struggling and divided. And these twin poles of love and critique came to form his project. This beautiful photo of a young woman presented as if she were an angel with a halo above her is one of my favorites in the exhibition. I think I'm allowed to say that. It captures a moment of mutual recognition, two souls meeting and moving on. Frank loved everyday Americans and wanted to celebrate them and celebrate those moments of connection. Yet, for those he viewed as too powerful or unfeeling, Frank launched arrows of critique, like this awkward image of a political poster. The cutout hole in the center, I love, because it seems to suggest that politicians are all the same. You can slot anyone into that place and it's going to be the same result every single time. So celebration and love on the left and a kind of disappointment on the right. Now, Webb and Frank photographed many of the same subjects: bars and cowboys, crowds, odd architecture, parades and trolleys. And while the photographers were drawn to similar subject matter, because that's what America looked like in 1955, their photographs and their styles are distinguished by their personalities, their idiosyncratic approaches, and unique decisions. Now, 29-year-old Frank, young and eager, traveled quickly by car and utilized that shot from the hip style. 49-year-old Webb walked thousands of miles, creating precise and carefully composed images. And through their words, we come to realize that both men recognize the same social ills on their cross-country journey in 1955. This kind of mindless and continuous consumption, unfortunate examples of racism, the tendency toward isolation, and they critiqued these systems in ways befitting their personalities. Yet both Webb and Frank, with hope in their hearts, also celebrated those things that they loved about America, namely connections with others, often surprising, often fleeting, but so important. And after returning home, Webb wrote in his journal another statement which seems to summarize both men's experiences. And he wrote, quote, "Each person has a set of values. Sometimes there is no realization of this. What are your values? I don't fit into this society too well. I don't have the drives and ambitions to be a so-called success in this world of money and power. And yet, I am a success." The truths both Frank and Webb encountered during their travels, those social ills of America, were irreconcilable with the idealized vision of America from popular media. Yet, in that distance between the myth and the reality, both men found fertile ground for their art and an expression of their personal beliefs and hopes. So, thank you. Happy to take lots of questions now.
Thank you, Lisa, for sharing that lovely kind of biographical introduction of these photographers, some of their work. I'm going to go ahead and scroll through the chat a little bit and see what questions people have posed. What I have here to start is, did Frank and Webb know each other? Did they photograph together?
These are great questions, and I feel like every question you guys are going to ask was one that I had in the research process, so it's great to ask them. They did know each other. In fact, when Todd Webb was living in Paris in the late 40s, Frank came to a New Year's Eve party at his apartment. They also were both mentored by Walker Evans. And that's a bit like of a secret because Walker helped Frank write his Guggenheim application, knew of Webb's application, and also served on the committee, which chose them both. So I love that. But one of the reasons that I chose to map Webb's journey is because we already had a map of Frank's journey. You know, it's such a popular project that there are maps everywhere of where he went. But my question was the same. Did they photograph together? Did they ever cross paths? And the answer is no. They chose different paths across the country. Frank was really interested in hitting more cities, and Webb kind of went straight across.
Great, thank you. Someone mentioned they would love to read the pages of the journal. Are those publicly available online anywhere or like a digital version?
So before Webb handed over those trunks to the dealer that never paid him the full price, and so they kind of got locked away, he did um, make an abridged version of his journal that is available in libraries. I can't remember the title right now, and I truly apologize for that. The Todd Webb Archive, however, has the entire, all of his daily journals. He started his daily journal in the 30s, really when he started photographing. So it's an incredible look at what it was like for a photographer in the late 30s and 40s and 50s. I love kind of tracking his friendships with everybody you want to know with about, I love learning what Lisette Modell had for lunch. All of these things for a photo nerd are just like, oh, can't be better. So the Todd Webb Archive has the full journals, which I think I read like 2 or 3 times in preparation for this show.
Awesome. Do you know if either photographer developed their film along the journey, or did they accumulate all of their rolls in film and wait until they got home at the end to develop them?
These are great questions, guys. So, different strategies. Webb struck a deal with Life magazine. He made a deal with the devil. He actually writes that in his journal that he knows he's kind of making a deal with the devil when he does this. Um, that he would send his rolls of film to Life. They would process the film, create contact sheets for him, and then send it to his next stop because he was so precise. He kind of knew where he should be at any moment along the 5 months. So he could see what was happening in his film as he moved along. Frank is not a planner in that way. So what he did instead was he would, accumulate all this film and then he'd stop at like a friend's house, like another photographer that he knew, and process his work in their darkroom. And what's very, very, very interesting about Frank doing this work in other people's dark rooms is we have letters from those photographers describing his process. And Wayne Miller, who you might all know his name, he was a famous Magnum photographer based in Chicago for a long time. He was out in Los Angeles at this point, and Frank went to Wayne's house and was developing film in his darkroom. Wayne writes about how Frank would process the film, hold it up in the darkroom, and cut out whole sections of it and throw it away. So we've actually never even seen everything he produced on this trip because some of it in his mind was not good enough and it went right in the trash.
That's wild. That there's so much of it that just, not so much, but parts of it that just
Yeah.
are gone. Um, did they reveal in their notes what cameras or lenses that they were using throughout the journey?
They did. And I could tell you, Frank is using 35 millimeter. Webb is armed with multiple cameras. He's using both 35 and a medium format 2 1/4. However, I would just like to say curators hate this question because I have yet to be in a painting lecture when anyone asks what kind of brush the painter was using. So just so you know, it's not the camera that makes the work, it's the photographer.
Absolutely. I have a question here. It says, what was the impact of staging his most famous photo of the soldier being shot?
Oh, not the same photographer. We're not, that's
Oh,
Kappa. We're not, yeah, not the
okay.
same photographer.
Thanks for the clarification. Um, Another question is, did anti-Semitism get noticed by either of them? I know we touched a little bit on some of the racism and segregation that they saw.
Yes, absolutely. They both photograph Jewish populations across the country, and Frank himself was Jewish and uh, really feel strongly that having a foreign accent, looking vaguely Jewish, and a little rumpled was the reason he was arrested multiple times.
You. How long did it take you to put together this exhibition? What was your development process like?
Uh, we are always working on exhibitions for at the minimum 3 years, and sometimes longer. So this one was a 3 year process. I'm working on things simultaneously. So, but the full timeline is about 3 years, which is also why if you asked me right now, I could tell you what I'm doing for the next 5 years because we have to plan out that far in advance.
Cool. Those are all the questions I am seeing in the chat right now. I'm gonna give another sec if anyone is thinking of anything. But otherwise, we highly encourage you folks to come and check it out. It's being installed right now and is going to open this weekend. So we're really excited for people to see all these photographs on the walls. Like Lisa said, we're going to have a case with some of their original notebooks and maquettes inside. So you'll get to see some of that. And we also have a lovely catalog to go along with the exhibition as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Oh, I see one more question. Um, did the photographers have any say in which pictures were shown? So,
Well, they're both past,
mhm.
so I tried to channel them as much as possible. You might have noticed that on the contact sheet of Webb's that I showed you, he had kind of grease penciled a few things. So I was aware of what he thought was successful, and I always try and follow that. But with Webb, I kind of had a clean slate. He had never shown this work ever. So it was up to me to kind of reconstruct that. I talked to his estate, I talked to the director of his archive. We all agreed on what is in the exhibition. I will say Frank's ultimate statement, obviously, is just that slim 83-page book, The Americans. So that's his ultimate vision. However, I'm not showing you everything in the Americans. You only get 50 photos from each artist. And I have to admit, I'm including some things that didn't make the final cut. But because I worked with the Robert Frank estate, they were able to show me, this is a photo that made it to like the final round and then like got edited out in the last second. And so I felt okay showing those two because they clearly, Frank felt very strongly about them. They just didn't make it into the book, but I felt okay putting them on the walls.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then one last question. Oh, two more. They're coming in. Is there, as the curator designing the exhibit, do you go to a panel for approval to get, like to move the project forward?
It's approvals all over the place at every step of the way. When you're working if you're working with a contemporary artist that's still living, you're working with them the whole time and getting approval from them the whole time. Even though both of my guys here in the exhibition had passed, I'm working with their estates the entire time to make sure everything's approved and everything's looking how they want to. And then within my own institution, yes, there are just levels and levels of approval process, like an approval process to start researching, an approval process to say, yes, we're putting it on the calendar. Yes, this is what the catalog will look like. Yes, this is what the exhibition will look like, all the way along. So you have to bring people on that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Is the exhibition scaled down at Brandywine from the earlier showings? I believe it's the same size.
Yeah, we're hovering at 100 photos, 50 from each photographer, keeping it even, and you'll see when they are brought together how similar the subject matter can be, and yet how different the stylistic treatment can be. And then you'll get a run of one photographer so that you'll understand their vision, and then we'll get another pairing and then move on. So I hope that you guys enjoy it.
Yeah, it's gonna be it's so great to see that comparison and contrast all on the same wall. It's different when you're, looking at images digitally on a screen or, printed on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for everyone who joined us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you at the Brandywine Museum of Art soon, and we'll be sending out this recording to everybody in a couple of weeks once we get it edited and put up on YouTube. Thanks for joining and have a great rest of your week. Stay warm, everybody.